Everybody hear me all right? Well, thanks for coming out to the second Living Writers reading series of the spring of 2013. Tonight we have Mr. Iain Pollock, who's a poet who we've been reading in class and hopefully thoroughly enjoying. Mr. Pollock lives in Philadelphia and teaches at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy, where he is the Cyrus H. Nathan Distinguished Faculty Chair for English. His first collection of poems, Spit Back a Boy, published by University of Georgia in 2011, won the 2010 Cave Canon Poetry Prize. Pollock earned a bachelor's degree in English from Haverford College and an MFA in Creative Writing from Syracuse University. He is a Cave Canon Fellow. And that's all the easy stuff to say, but I'm also going to say that Iain is a man of perseverance. This morning I was supposed to pick him up at the Ottawa airport. I'm not going to take the story away from him. I'll let him tell you all the excitement. But I just as I was pulling up to the Ottawa International Airport, thinking Iain would shortly be joining me, I get a call, and I look down and it's from Iain, and I think, oh, great, we're both right on the same page, right on time. And I answer it, and he says, Phil, I'm in Newburgh. And I was like, Newburgh where? Newburgh, New York. Anyway, it's been an eventful day, and there were a few points where I was ready to just call the whole thing off and say, we got to cancel this, but Iain persevered and traveled on planes, trains, and automobiles to get here to join us. So please join me in welcoming Iain Pollock. And actually, also, just before we welcome him, this is a great time to shut your cell phones off. Sorry to do that, but shut your cell phones off. Now let's welcome Iain Pollock.
I just wanted to start with some thank yous. First of all, to Professor Lamarche for inviting me and facilitating it. Facilitating the reading, and to the college for having me and making the space and the funds available to bring them up. In my time, I've been to some definite boring poetry readings, and so before I start boring you with poetry, I thought that I would do a little show and tell. I have my passport, which I was intending to use today. And if you were to look at my passport, you would see that the last stamp, I believe, is from, the Philip S. W. Goldson International Airport in Belize City, Belize, not the Ottawa Airport, where I was expecting to get it stamped this morning. This is my Canadian Customs form. It has my name, my birth date on it. I was not intending to bring any firearms or other weapons, such as switchblades, mace, or pepper spray into Canada. And I did not have $10,000 Canadian or American, and was not planning on bringing that into Canada. We had a mechanical failure on the plane. And it's funny, at school these days there's this big thing in education that it's okay to fail. It's like okay for kids to fail. And when the pilot came on and said, we've had a mechanical failure, I started to realize the flaw of that logic. Sometimes it's not okay to fail. Like when you're in the hydraulic system of the plane, it is not okay to fail. So the flight was canceled, and, I sat around for an hour and a half and no one told me anything. I'm really glad they're recording this, so I can say, never fly US Air, it's the worst airline in America. So, now that's on record. But luckily I'm getting around to thanking other people for my being here. There's this great woman at the budget car rental desk called Lynn, who put up with me being very irritated and stressed out, and Philadelphians get aggressive when back to the corners, or when they feel like things aren't going to work out. So I was getting a little aggressive, and she was really nice. So Lynn, thank you if you ever see this. And she also upgraded. I just wanted, to save the college money because I wasn't sure if I was going to be reimbursed for the plane trip that lasted half an hour and got me a couple hundred miles. So she upgraded me to a compact car, to a nice car, to a Passat, even though I was trying the smallest car available. So I appreciated that. And thank you to the New York State Troopers, various county sheriffs, and local authorities who did not pull me over in the course of my driving from Newburgh, which is about 5.5 hours from here. So thank you. People behind me were pulled over, but for some reason the trooper didn't decide not to pull me over. So thank you to the powers that be, and to Google Maps for getting me here. This is probably the second most isolated place. I was in eastern Kentucky once, and I couldn't see the road. I could actually see the road up here. And I grew up in central New York, right? So I'm 87 is great, 90 is great, even Route 12 is great. Then I get to Loudville, and that's about where my knowledge of the world ends. And yeah. So okay, I'll try to. I was giving a reading yesterday at a school in the Bronx, and my jokes felt so flat. So I'm going to try not to be funny today, because I think I'm hoping my poems are better than mine. So Professor LaMarche wanted me to talk a little bit about my path to being a writer, and I'll spend a little bit of time on it and maybe leave some space for questions, because I don't want to say more than you're wanting to hear about the process. I don't think there was like a definitive point where I decided that I wanted to be a writer or to be a poet. I mean, I had probably the same poetry education that you all had in high school, which is to say that it was useless and unhelpful. Largely, and I got in trouble for saying this last night actually, because I felt like I spent too much time on modernism and some literature that is very arcane, and it doesn't seek to make an emotional connection with readers, and that I think is is the place of scholars to unpack, is the place for sort of upper level courses to unpack. And I really wish, and when I teach middle school and high school, and I really wish that my teachers had taught a class like this, some contemporary poetry that got people interested. And it really wasn't until I started as a graduate student to read contemporary poetry, or poetry after Lowell and Bishop, so poetry after the 1960s, that I really felt a deep kinship with poetry. There were two exceptions to what I'm saying. One is my parents bought me this great anthology when I was very young, when I was probably 9 or 10 and living in Southern California. It's called I Am the Darker Brother. And it's an anthology of modern black poems. I think it came out in the 60s. To date it, Leroy Jones is called Leroy Jones and not Mary Baraka in the volume, so it's pre-Black Arts Movement. I want to read one poem which, I've now been reading for almost 20 years and remains my favorite poem. Those Winter Sundays, Robert Hayden. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked me. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? The other exception, another moment that sort of turned me on to poetry was I happened to have a teacher my senior year who wasn't intimidated by poetry. I find the general population is intimidated by poetry. I think it's because it happens so quickly, right? When you read a novel, you have hundreds of pages to sort of figure out what's happening. You have time to breathe. And in a short story, that's compressed a little more, but you still have time to breathe and sort of tease everything out. But in a poem, everything is so compressed and happens so quickly that it requires us to pay attention and reread. And as a culture, I don't think we do a good job of paying attention anymore. So therefore, people seem a little intimidated by poetry. But I had this great teacher who wasn't intimidated by poetry and had us reading this fantastic stuff, stuff that again I've been reading since that point. And I wanted to read a W.H. Auden poem that has always stuck with me. And strangely enough, W.H. Auden was a teacher of Robert Hayden's. My French is terrible. The title means Museum of Fine Arts in French. Musée des Beaux-Arts. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position. How it takes place while someone else is eating, or opening a window, or just walking dully along. How when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there must always be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The plowman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Both of those poems will factor into some other things that I was hoping to talk about today. And I had about 9 things that I wanted to talk about and poems that go along with that. Because I often get questions like, I want to be a writer, what should I do? And one of the first, and I think most important things that I think about is, for the most part, I just try to live my life. I try to not spend all of my time in the ivory tower or in the academic world. I try to get out and take unnecessary 5-hour drives. So I guess you guys there help me, help my poetry, and that could be their retort. And in the course of living my life, I see images, I have thoughts, right? And then I try to incorporate that into the art as much as possible. And I'll start with a new poem. I was sitting in the backyard this summer. It was actually in September, and there was a cicada humming, and it just seemed late in the year for a cicada to be doing that, and that sort of got me thinking about cicadas. I did some research and read this. I really like Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson. No one else seems to like him. He doesn't seem to go it. I love it. So there's this great Tennyson poem about a Greek mythological figure who turns into a cicada and lives forever. And the title is from that poem. Of happy men have the power to die. With hollow trachea, timble and hum, we call ourselves to final prayer. Degree by degree, air cools to autumn until we are incongruous. We rise, mistaken for plague, from the humus to slump on oaken trunks, to split our bodies open to meet the promise of a God, his altar cracked and covered in the debris and rot of years, to make the passage on the bark of our small death into life, life palsied and heaving where we once had lungs. Actually, when I started, well, this is the first time I've said the word humus, right? Usually when I read this poem, I've been saying hummus, which is really embarrassing. And usually it's also being recorded, so now there's at least 3 other times where I've said hummus instead of humus. But I was also trying to write a poem, like a Twitter poem, in 140 characters, and it proved really difficult to say anything important in 140 characters, but it was an interesting experiment because it got me that sort of distillation that I like in poetry. It got everything sort of condensed in a nice way. I moved to Philadelphia in 2007, and it was a really violent summer in the history of the city. It seems as though someone died every day, usually, as a result of gun violence. And I happened to be walking through the city one day and saw this kid with like a hipster kid with a shirt that said Philadelphia on it. And I think he was trying to be funny and ironic, and it just coalesced my dislike of irony, right? Because people are dying, it's not really legit. And then a couple nights later, there were gunshots outside my house, and I heard someone running up the street, and sirens went crazy, and it got me thinking about Philadelphia. Pop, 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 pop! And before sirens echo, 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 up streets laid out like wire mesh in a pen, where pit bull bitches, through chains, starve, their scarred throats into yells, sneaker soles slap clap on asphalt until their stride sinks into rumble grumble of daybreak trolleys, trundling down steel tracks, newsprint, smack whacking pitch onto gum model pavement and corner markets, security gates flung up in a rickety racket at Mount Zion's storefront worship, skittery skitter of boys kicking a doll's head to the bus stop, molded lids ticking open and shut over glazed, unreal eyes, raccoons crash dash as it drags a near-dead pigeon from a rust-pitted trash can, fluttery stutter of the bird's one good wing flapping to lift its carcass into still, darksome dawn. So as I'm in the process of living my life, I try and be a careful observer. And so there was a time period after I got the iPhone where I would just stare at the iPhone anytime I had downtime, and I realized eventually that was the enemy of my poetry, right? Like there's a lot of great stuff in a dentist's office, and you sort of have to pay attention to it. And somehow maybe that will filter into the poem. When you're waiting in the grocery store to check out, people are having fascinating conversations, they're buying the most interesting things. Last time I was in Target, so this is maybe a month after Valentine's Day, this woman was buying reduced price Valentine's themed lingerie, right? And the woman, which seems embarrassing to have to put on the conveyor belt. I never even want to put underwear or anything else. Anything else I'm going to mention in this category on the conveyor belt. And then the woman who was checking her out couldn't find the barcode, so it was flipping this lingerie all around, right? And it just got to the awkwardness of the situation for everyone who was observing. Just got to be overwhelming. And that's the type of stuff I would love to put in a poem today. Or on my drive up here, there was, there must be some Mennonites down the road, because there was a horse and buggy hitched at a Family Dollar store. And that would have blown my mind, except there are all these Amish in Philadelphia, and the teenagers are always on their cell phones, which I thought was verboten, which is not allowed. But apparently, if, in the course of doing your work, you need technology, you're allowed to use it. So they're in this market called Reading Terminal Market selling their wares, and they need to be in touch with different people. But these kids seem to be doing what I'm sure you all do, and what teenagers do, and that's chatting on the phone. So luckily I wasn't totally overwhelmed by the image of a horse and buggy at the Family Dollar store. But it did get me thinking that next time I have to fly somewhere, I'm just going to rent a horse and buggy ride and fly you upstairs. So I try to be as observant as possible when I'm out in the world. And these are poems where I'm trying to pay attention to the world around me as much as possible. Spring and the catkins. Cloth pansies, their yellow fading, planted in the neighbor's flower box. A Kenmore washer, the model still in my parents' basement, oxidating in a grassed-over loft. Gray as newsprint in the rain, a nest of paper wasps clinging below the pussy willow's catkins. I tried to accept these as beautiful today and couldn't. How did you choose a life with me? How did you forgive me for myself? So I teach at this private school, in Philadelphia. There's very beautiful grounds, and it's funny. All these people end up in my poems and somehow think that they're famous. And I want to tell them that being in poems doesn't make you famous. It's not like Jay-Z is saying your name to hundreds of millions of people. So there's this kid who's really excited to be in this poem, because I mentioned to him that I saw him like miss this fly ball during baseball practice one day, and like, anytime he'll like come up to my room and just like want me to read the poem to him. It's kind of cute. But then I had to explain to him one day that the poem is about how all my students are going to die. But he still likes the poem. The school march. Each day's festival. The rain has let up. The school and grounds are shade darker for the soaking. The leaves embark on a holly outside my classroom window, to the red roof, to the red path and tulip trees lining it, to a cherry sprouting ruffled pink across the road, a heavy, dank beauty, a beauty I could not grasp when I was like the boys screaming on the playing fields. The right fielder spills into wet grass, pulling back petals to shag a lazy fly ball. And the music teacher, her father dying at Mercy Fitz, walks down the path to her car. Going to lunch, I held the door and envied her raincoat while my sopping shirt clung to my chest. I recognize her now by that coat, her face covered by the dome of an umbrella, slick and blue-black, saving her from the false rain still dripping off the trees. When she rounds the corner, wind kicks up, pulling blossoms and leaf buds off branches, and the storm starts in again. Boys scamper from the fields and, not checking the road for cars as their cleats clack a stampede on the dampened asphalt, race under the eaves to the gym, where they stand shoulder to shoulder, each wriggling in his place, as if an innocent man leaned on a wall and, with his own sweat-dark bandana, made blind. And using the pronoun he, I'm not trying to be sexist. I do teach at an all-boys school, so a lot of students are. And I also wanted to read this poem because, coming from a more southern region, I wanted to tell you that spring is coming. It will arrive. There are buds on the trees in Philadelphia, so hold fast. I know it'll take 2 more months up there. You get to a point, right? Like, at first, there's just like snow up on the hills or in the mountains and the Catskills, and then, probably around, not quite Louisville, but, like Remsen, like you see all the snow on the ground, and then eventually, like I ran into like a little snow flurry out on 812. So, living my life, observing carefully, and then I also try to read obsessively. I say the time that I dedicate to writing, I spend probably 75% of it reading and 25% of it writing. And some of that is reading other literature, other poets, other fiction writers, trying to develop techniques that I can use in my own poems. And some of it is just to grab background information, right? Obviously I write a lot from an autobiographical perspective, but I think at some point you have to transcend that. You need material about which you can write. During graduate school, I had to take classes outside of creative writing, which I'm very thankful for. And I took this great, the subject matter wasn't great, but it was a well-taught class. It was on the archaeology of slavery, which I was shocked to find out is like a relatively new discipline within the archaeological world. And in the course of doing all this reading for this class, I just got some powerful images, and it got me thinking about sort of the scope of Black history in our country. And so this poem has images, some from that class, some from family stories, and some from that that you pick up in the course of your education, both sort of academic and personal. And I intersperse lyrics from a blues song, a famous blues song called Poor Boy. And you'll hear those lyrics and you can understand. Hard bop for Poor Boy. Dream song high, dream Shango of thunder, dream cicatrix, dream Costa de Oro, dream termite mounds, white ants, yourself devoured, dream Virginia and piney woods, tobacco hung from rafters, dream carnage of angels, dream pole star, dream draped mania, dream cypress swamp, moon and water like a milk drop on mother's breast, dream barred owl and copperhead, dream cur and bloodhound. Babe, I can't stay here long. Dream muddy waters of Jordan, dream homestead chickens roosting in the sweet gum, dream clapboard and mule skinning, cigar box, gut bucket, dream bottomlands flooding, dream High John the Conqueror, dream hex, dream devils and paints, nickel-buried buffalo up, dream night riders, dream torch and shroud blade rope. Babe, I can't stay here long. Dream Illinois Central Union Station, dream brick and rust, red-lined, dark town, sourness of rotting, dream meat packing and steel furnace, flat iron and gas stove, last hired, first fire, dream dice in the same pot liquor, the same sermon and shout, dream red summer, dream that same truncheon, dream badge up north by the white man, how a white hood do down south, same pistol whip and dog snarl, don't look me in the eye, get quick to shoot, dream revolver, that same revolver, revolver, that same revolver, that same dream. Babe, I can't stay here long. I'm a poor boy, long way from home. Poor boy, and a long way from home. And then, in addition to various sort of academic or literary things, journalism isn't entirely dead. So, I'm often interested in sort of those human interest stories, and came across a story of a murder that had happened in Philadelphia, and it just seemed sort of iconic to me for the way that murders sometimes happen. And just to say that not all your reading needs to be War and Peace and Ulysses and all these sort of really heavy texts, but there's value in all sorts of reading. And a British history of American violence. The boys are picking over garbage cans and smashing window glass with a heave of glass bottles. Hold them by the scruff and leave them to their wildness. Time in the pest house of school or seasoning in an irrigation ditch will only move them to boredom with bare knuckles and stolen knives. Their insecurity will concentrate on the grip of a Glock until an enemy who a minute before was unknown and not an enemy appears under a streetlight. The provocation will be slight, soft palms hardening into a shove. In days to come, friends of the enemy will strip the bark from the few trees they know and graffiti their grief on the trunk. And the boys, even after the candle jars have filled with rainwater and plastic rose bouquets have somehow wilted in the humidity, the boys will also mourn their killed. In their woe, they will want for a light to slow drag through them, a light like the reflection of sequin or chrome. They will not find it, and they will not find it until they are discovered face up in a dirt lot, where neighbors remember a house a while back was torn down, where now bricks and teeth of glass push up like Indian bones through the soil. I also spend a lot of time remembering. And I think memory is sort of the original seed of fiction, right? Because it's one of the first things that we do after sort of walking and talking as we move into a more mature consciousness, right? And so we all have memories, but your memories of this event will be different between all of you. Some of you will be like, that is the most boring thing I've ever heard. And some of you said, that man is a genius. He's destined to win a Nobel. And the truth will be somewhere in between, right? So it's impossible to capture exactly that moment. So I think, for me, memory is a really easy place from which to write, because it's necessarily fiction. And even in the places where I'm using first person, right? I'm still fictionalizing events, right? It's still one piece of me. There's, even if the margin is this much, there's still a difference between me as the poet and the I in the poem. So the I is always, to me, a character, even when it's based on me. This poem has some objectionable language in it. And I was once asked not to use the objectionable language because I was talking on the radio, And the station in Philadelphia had been fined the day before by the FCC because, quote, a cocksucker got through. And I thought she meant that someone had run into the booth and started swearing, but she meant that someone had said that word during the course of a radio program, and the FCC had come down hard on the station. So interestingly, they defined curse words interestingly to me. They didn't ask me to not read the N-word, but there were some other words that they asked me not to read. So I may make a mistake, because I still have them sort of scratched out, so I didn't offend the good people at WHYY and in the city of Philadelphia. But I guess it's really the FCC is the problem, so I shouldn't blame WHYY. And Old City, you'll be surprised to find out, is the oldest part of Philadelphia. It's where the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall are located. Boy, yeah, Old City. I am the mayor, shrieks the red-boned woman, wearing 2 coats and sitting on a bench along the parkway when I mumble, "How are you?" at her. And on the trip back from Reading Market, she's leaning against the fence to a baseball diamond at Von Colm and raving, "Don't let them fool you. We ain't winning the Civil War. We still fighting that shit." Watching her, I slip again into the summer after 2nd grade when my mother drove me, her half-breed son, into Philadelphia to see the Liberty Bell, and the black faces she worried were too few. In our dairy town, where most color was her king. Draggling over cobblestones shadowed by the spires of Independence Hall, a roomy-eyed bag lady, midnight black, narrow shoulders widening into a paunch, towed a trash-packed handcart that clattered with each lopsided roll. I stared at her, the 3-whiskered mole, until she seemed one of the goddesses, bare-breasted and round-bellied, squatting along my mother's bureau. I think now I enjoyed her strangeness, her possible divinity, but was terrified, too, that she had the means, under her red shawl, or in the billow of plastic bags jouncing in her cart, to destroy a boy like me. The woman caught me gawking. She curled her face ugly, jabbed out her tongue, and taunted me in a drawl fit for the South. "Take a motherfucking picture. Ain't you never seen a nigga?" I flung my almost white self into my mother's embrace. That brown embrace, I hoped, would swallow me whole and spit back a boy 4 shades darker, while the woman chuntered away, her cart rattling over cobblestones worn by centuries of traffic. So that was based on one of my earliest memories of a family trip to Philadelphia, and I stared at this homeless woman too long, and she stuck out her tongue and said more or less what the character says in the poem. And then I lived in Southern California for a while, so you can imagine if you were an 11-year-old and you live in this paradise where it's 74 and sunny every day, and then one day your parents move you to Utica, New York. And it's gray for 10 months and snows for 9 of those 10 months. Then you might not be that happy. You might look fondly upon your days in Southern California. And I had some really good friends there who were the sons of Hank Aaron's cousin, which is really unimportant to the poem, other than the fact that it lets me pontificate about baseball and say that Hank Aaron will always be my home run champ. Flight. The Aaron boys have brilliant African names. Shango, Boo, Amilca, Oginga. Above our apartment block, from an embankment crowned with Pueblo-style townhouses plastered in faux adobe, Boo and Shango fire rocks at the younger of us. Crouching in the sparse cover of scrub and imported pines, Mil Gang and I rise and return salvos of gravel and dirt clods. The goal isn't to hit the target, just a near miss to make eyes bulge like grapes, pushed from their skin, or force a shriek we find girlish and laugh at later. Townhouse roofs line the ridge form an audience of furrowed terracotta brows, while we scrabble up and down the slope, tripping the skein of crawling brush, drop quickly to our bellies when bulleting rocks come close. Errant throws from the battle fly over low adobe walls behind the townhouses and skate across their concrete patios. We dodge and laugh and yell and don't notice a white woman wrench open her sliding glass door and rampage into her enclosed yard. If you throw one more rock, I'll call the police on you little fuckers. 500 years kicking. We scatter like Angola boys from the first Portuguese. And I think one other aspect of being a writer, like I think a lot of writers want to be like wholly original, right? Like I think Jack Kerouac in some ways like what American writers want to be. And there's this fiction that he just like sort of wrote everything down, and it was like, you know, he was this zany, crazy writer, and he was creating a new style, and he didn't revise. And you know, now people have found his manuscripts that are different from what was final, right? So he was revising. But I think there's that pressure to be original, and my writing became a lot better when I let go of that pressure and just begged, borrowed, and stole from other writers. Sometimes from their biographies, and not just writers, other artists as well. Sometimes from their biographies, sometimes lines, as in using a line from a blues song. And in this poem follows the biography of Hart Crane, who was a modernist poet. He wrote a famous poem about the Brooklyn Bridge. And he was an alcoholic and had a difficult life. He was gay at a time when it obviously wasn't kosher. And that is thought to have contributed to his alcoholism. And he ended up dying in unclear circumstances. He had been on a long bender in Mexico and was being brought back to the States. And it's not clear if he jumped off the back of the ocean liner or just sort of slipped and fell off the back of it. And interestingly, and this is sort of a terrible irony, he was the heir to the Lifesavers fortune, the Candy Lifesavers. Hart Crane. And so I had a hard time. I have a hard time with modernism, as I said earlier. But there was this moment in the poem where he mentioned this minstrel who was a black man who would paint his face even darker to entertain white audiences. And I realized that there was this moment of masking going on in this longer poem that made it more accessible for me. Hart Crane is Jim Crow. I was wrong. You weren't a madman, just a minstrel without burnt pork or the courage to steal chickens. At the East River, eyeing the barely men who reminded you of Ohio before the fall, you finally understood the acetylene burn of progress, the elemental rupture of the age, inferno lit on fuse of pure air. But you were too far gone then to raise an alarm against it. Loathing had spread into lymph and bone, and so you called to the man-made myth of the sky and praised the juggernaut that crushed you. Added a plaque to the cairn of steel and empire that buried you day by day. Hark, your bridge was framed in tar and sugar. Its hum of traffic, the pulse of cane knife through stalk, and the rum that helped you through the hurricane was, like communion wine, spiked with blood. But you knew this, did you, who died a slave's death over the side of the ship? Rest, heart, raging mass, rest of the Atlantic and her dead. In Philadelphia, I live near the Art Museum, which is great. They keep having shows, and I go there and really want to love the art and end up not liking it. I keep writing about paintings that I don't. Philadelphia also has a well-known garbage problem. It also has a pothole problem. So one day a friend of mine came out and I was driving and noticed that someone had stuffed bags of garbage in the pothole, which seems, ingenious Philadelphia problem solving. We have two problems, potholes and garbage. But if you put them together, maybe the problem is lessened a little. Violets for your furs. Garbage men in this city don't see fit to put the garbage in the garbage truck. And in the streets, the dented bottles and cans spin and roll like the gait of a man clutching a brown-sacked beer in his hand. The discount grocer on Girard sells week-old cuts of pork and tins of black beans a day from expert. and the antique dealer by the bus stop hawks one-eyed dolls and green vases. I haven't once in 3 years seen the store open for business. In Dancing Girl with Castanets, the model with the figure's head, Gabrielle Renard, is posed with rouge on her cheeks, a garland of indulgent red flowers in her hair. She looks bored. And I know this boredom from Maria Humphrey's eyes in school when I told her, I love you. I can't figure now why she never protested in the hall when I'd stare so brazenly at her tits. As for the girl's body, for his gaze, Renoir never paid Georgette Peugeot, arms bared by a diaphanous traje de flamenca more Hellenic than Iberian. Will I always want something other than what I have? Which is to wonder, who knows if I ever loved Ria? Probably not, as maybe the young can never love, or not the young as unbroken as I was. Let's just agree, Gabrielle. Let's just agree, Georgette. I went about it all wrong. The garbage men are back, darling. Bottles and cans pressed to heart. Bottles and cans. Bottles and cans pressed to heart. Bottles and cans. And I'm sure as many of you were as children, I was subjected to long, tedious stories. Or my elders subjected me to long, tedious stories. For a long time I didn't see the value of those stories. And as I become older, I've started listening more to those stories and seeing not only the wisdom of them, but the structure of them, how well told those stories are, and how valuable those stories are in transmitting history. So I try and pay as much attention to, my mother and my aunts when they speak. When my grandparents were alive, I tried to spend some time with them when they were older, listening to those stories and understanding sort of where the family had been, where they had been. Upon irremediable shores, those who never had time. We see the hump of a cardinal, male, more flamboyant for digging in the snow, after seeds set loose in the blizzard. In the powder's mute and stop motion, nothing but the beating of the clock, replica of Victoria Station, 1905. Here's the real memory. On Alvera Street, I bought a marionette of Pancho Villa riddled with 9 bullets. And the false, during my 9th birthday party, I swung at a piñata macheted into Christ's burning heart, crowned with a thicket of blackberry thorns. If we broke open this heart with a broomstick, what sweetness would fall into the dust? Does it matter that my family has no history of senility or dementia? The women, those with no funds for tobacco, live forever. The men die of mustard gas. The old crow brand of bourbon, arrest, cardiac, or criminal. Oh, but my mother jigged with Jim Crow once, the first little black girl to sit downstairs, not in either heaven, and butter her face with popcorn at that darn cat, the Lee Theater, Hampton, Virginia. Preacher from a church where she worshipped not deemed her historical. And me, how would the Holy Spirit diagnose me? And the real, batter my wounded knee, and the false, bury my heart a 3-person God. So as you may have been able to pick up, my mother is black and my father was white. And my father actually grew up in England. And he grew up in a town called Lancaster, which is in the northwest of the country. And he was doing some family research and found out that Lancaster was the 4th largest port of origin for slave ships. So it created this really interesting family conversation and dynamic where, some of my father's family's money must have come through the slave trade, and then, my mother's family was forcibly moved by that slave trade, and here they are meeting, and then they have children who have both histories, and you can imagine the complexity that's created there. And in this poem, the Igbo are a Nigerian ethnic group who are known for not taking slavery very well. Not that any ethnic group took well slavery, but the Igbo were a especially the recalcitrant. They would commit mass suicide. They would walk into the ocean and basically drown themselves. But these legends came up, and the one I mentioned is from Jamaica, but I also know that these stories are in North Carolina also, that after they had drowned themselves, they turned into birds and flew back to Africa. Back to Igbo. Port of origin, Lancaster. A group of Igbo linked arms and walked off Jamaica into the Caribbean, Cannibal Sea. Behind them, the wind susu and arrows of bourbon came, overpowering nectar of boiling houses, tang of iron and door hinges and horse bits, in manacles and flintlocks. When salt swallowed breath, Igbo souls leapt from the water as great sea eagles. Talons gripped black bodies as a she-bear lifts her cub from the scrub. Winds throbbed air until all passed back to Igbo land. I knew this, knew before I heard the stories, read the books. Knew from the whispering of my black mother's blood into my marrow. Knew also the mocking tap of rain on the hull christened in my white father's city. Knew how the ship lolled and pitched, how timbers creaked and creaked, all night creaked. All day it was night creek, over dull slab of waves on brine-soaked wood creek, over groans from hunger and foul air and flux and lost sisters creaked and creaked in the hollow chamber of a boy's ear, creaked, timbers creaked. And the final sort of consideration I have when I'm writing is that I try in some way to get over myself. Especially since I'm writing in the first, I often write using the romantic eye, the first person. There's this danger in being solipsistic and being sort of self-indulgent and writing too much about yourself in a way that's not connected to other people, right? I think ultimately, if you really dig down into your own experience, other people will see themselves reflected in that experience, and therefore your experience becomes sort of universal in a way. But I also think there's a danger in being too subjective. So I do, and I hope it's been clear that I do try and consider other people when I'm writing. And one of the times that other people's experience was most clear to me was after I visited New Orleans after Katrina. And I had been to the city 3 or 4 times prior to that to visit a friend who lived there, and so felt a deep connection and kinship to the city. I was really struck by the devastation. I was also struck by these marks that were on almost all the buildings that hadn't been renovated. And it was an X, and sometimes the X had a circle around it, and there were all these markings in the different quadrants of the X. And I used everyone's favorite research tool, Google, to figure out what these markings meant. And they're the marks that search parties make when they go through a disaster area and try and find bodies or survivors, and they check out property to see what state it's in, what damage has been. And it occurred to me that if you know how to decipher these X's, they tell a story, right? And it got me thinking about all the narratives, not just in Katrina, but also some flooding that happened in downstate New York where my mother grew up. And some of those great old blues songs were about floods. Like Led Zeppelin never stole the song, so you probably know them, When the Levee Breaks. Right, it was about some flooding that happened along the Mississippi in the early 20th century. Chorus of X, the rescuer's march. X say search party, say month, say day. X say live wire, say gas leak, say flood water, say dead dog, dead cat. X say no dead bodies, say 1 dead body, say 2, say 3 dead bodies, say 4. X say kitchen, say bedroom, say attic, say the family Bible floated next to me 5 days before the waters carried it off. X say that dog was a loud-ass, mean-ass bitch anyway. Say rain and wind on the roof was like every song I ever heard. The slow and angry, the Sunday ones and off tune, pretty ones and ones that whine like a porch door hanging on busted hinges. played all together on harp, on fiddle, tuba, trumpet, on banjo, on every instrument man saw fit to make. X say, Lord, you've been flooding us too much. Say most of the family moved north and west, got tired of humidity and high water, called when they could. Say, if you loot this, you only stealing from nature, and that woman always take back what hers. X say, it got easier to die in water than live on land. Say, you missed me buried under plaster, and paint shreds, and wall stud, and door, and shingle, and pictures of my grandbabies. Say, we here, and you never be rid of us. Say, my worst sins were pride and white lies I recited every morning like Mama's daily prayers. X say, lungs full of flood in the end took me higher than liquor ever did. Say, black water loved me more than my daddy ever did. Say, pestilence, say, quarantine, say, lamb's blood, say, slave ship, say, witch trials, say, the Washita River ran cold and the Cheyenne were still sleeping. Say, the monk doused himself in gasoline. Say, God, say, man, say, not all of us are saved. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions if you have any.
Have you ever thought about writing stories?
I have. So for that reason, that part of me that really wants me to push myself past my own experience. Would like to write stories, but ultimately sort of fails. It's difficult for me to get out of my own psychology in a lot of ways. And the idea of and I rarely can anticipate what other people are going to say. I'm always surprised by the things that people say. So the idea of having to write dialogue really terrifies me. I just wouldn't know what someone else would say in a given situation. Maybe I could get it right a quarter of the time if I was lucky, but you know, when I read a good story, part of the pleasure is how authentic the dialogue is when a writer gets that dialogue pitch perfect. So I mean, you'll see that I have snippets of speech, but it's usually like received speech, things I've heard people say, and maybe I'll change it a little bit to fit the rhythm of the poem, or to fit the metaphor of the poem. But for the most part, like, I'm not making up some things. The dialogue is in my poem. So that seems to be the sort of something as well. So I guess I could write a poem, a story about dialogue, that wouldn't be satisfying. I'm never quite satisfied when there's not enough of human interaction. And poetry is probably fiction. Right, Professor Moore.
I was wondering who had influence on you as far as your music style, your listening style of music, and did music in general influence you becoming a poet? I mean, I noticed a lot of music references in your poetry, so I was just wondering what that correlation was.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, growing up in usually predominantly white settings and then having been taught to be proud of my black heritage, but not really, like, my mother did her best, but that wasn't sort of reinforced by the school systems where I was. So I became really drawn to hip hop because there were young black men who were intellectual role models to me. And the hip hop I was listening to was sampling a lot of jazz. And so that got me in a backward motion from hip hop. Like even where like hip hop became so influenced by drug culture as to be unlistenable for me. Like even so, like the Dr. Dre, Biggie Smalls sort of moment. Like even those guys are sampling like the Isaac Brothers and Parliament Funkadelic. And so I mean that's what I listen to now. I listen to a lot of the stuff that was sampled by those young men to whom I was listening at that point. And so that kind of came together in that was sort of like, that was my ideal of what a poem should be, right? It should be words and music together. And so in some ways my poems are just a gigantic failure at writing like a hip hop poem. It's sort of my version of that. And that also some of it is just, I think in those moments when you're listening to music, especially when I'm driving in a car and listening to music, like my brain relaxes a little bit and seems to create some room for poetry, and somehow the music that I'm listening to seeps into to the poems. And I guess I'm just also interested. I mean, I don't think I'm using music in a revolutionary way. I think if you go back and look at the canon of Black poetry, you'll see it Langston Hughes being the most obvious example. So that idea of mixing popular culture with high art is sort of something that I'm interested in continuing. So the poem I read was Winter Sundays is my favorite poem. And I like it for a couple different reasons. If you were to go back and look at the poem, this really interesting thing happens with the sound. There are a lot of hard consonants early on in the poem. So, got, closed, blue, black, cold, cracked, ached, weekday, banked, banked, wake, cold, splintering, breaking, call, right, chronic angers, speaking. Okay. There are all these words that are really harsh, and it mimics the relationship that the speaker has to his father, right? He doesn't like his father. His father, there's some suggestion that his father was abusive, so it's harsh to him. And then at the end of the poem, it moves from these hard consonant sounds to these soft vowel sounds. Cold, polished, good, shoes, no, loves austere, lonely offices, right? And the speaker as an adult kind of softens in his view of his father, right? He realizes that his father sort of did what he had to do to raise the family and wasn't perfect, but sort of manned his post and stuck by his family and tried to do his best even though he was obviously flawed. So that idea of matching the sound to the content of the poem is something that I really admire in this poem. And also that idea of moving beyond yourself, right? It's, now that I'm a parent, I realize it's really easy to judge your parents. For example, I'm going to sell my wife out here. The other day, she dropped our kid twice. And it wasn't really, she wasn't being malicious, you know, it was just, kids are wriggly, they fall. Those of you who are parents have been there, right? And it would be easy to blame a parent for doing that, but, you know, accidents happen, you're overtired as a parent, you know, there are all these factors. So that idea of understanding someone else and someone else's experience is sort of a model I try to use in my own poems. And then the poem is also 14 lines long, which, you know, automatically puts you in mind of a sonnet. Usually a sonnet is a love poem written to a love, like a romantic love poem. But this is a familial love poem, and I think it's interesting the way the father is sort of absent in the poem in the way that a lover, the beloved, is absent in a Shakespearean sonnet. So I like that Hayden was writing about his experience, which was a specifically Black experience. He wrote in Chicago, Detroit. Right. But he's also matching that experience to the history of English language poetry. I'm really interested in that mix, again, of high art and vernacular experience. But that question is really hard to answer because I love so many poems. You know, almost all the poems in this book I love. What's your favorite poem? You don't have one? Okay. That needs to change.
Why
I might be out of my depth in that question. I don't know. I mean, I think some of it, you may be able to tell that I don't know modernism. But I think there was this moment where poetry moved away. Like, William Blake was a rock star, right? People loved his poems. He was popular.